Chapter 9 A Long Day's Paddle. The brigade was up at 4 a.m., and with the long Sioux behind them, the voyageurs were in great spirits. While Mr. McKay was still in his tent getting dressed, Lalone grinned and said, "Watch this." Pierre's eyes widened as Lalone sneaked behind McKay's tent and released the support poles. To everyone's delight, the tent collapsed. Unbothered, McKay crawled out the door opening and stood with his pants half-mast. Pulling his suspenders up, he eyed the likely culprit. "Top of the morning to you, gentlemen," the big Scotsman said, making no effort to hide his grin. "It cheers my heart to see y'all so anxious to get underway." "That we are, sir," Lalone replied, "and awaiting your good guidance." And with that, they all had a good laugh. Pierre chuckled until his belly felt warm. The prospect of a day-long paddle was frightening, but the good humor of the morning relaxed him, and as they started upriver, La Petite and Lalone led the men in song. Old French sea chants, folk songs, and silly rhymes echoed up and down the river as Pierre dug in with his paddle. The sun warmed Pierre's shoulders as it rose, illuminating the left-handed shore and finally the river. Thin trails of mist lifted off the water. Birds rustled through the dry leaves on the bank nearby. A stilt-legged heron stalked his breakfast in a reed bed. Pierre tried to follow his bowman's advice. He sang along with them. He studied the stately pines and the distant ridges. He imagined where the blue Ottawa would eventually lead them, but his hands still throbbed. Forgetting the effort of paddling by losing himself to another thought sounded simple, but his hands were so puffed and swollen that he felt as if chunks of skin were pulling loose from them. He thought about school, imagining Celeste in her seat by the window. He saw the morning sun shining on her silky black hair and her blue dress, patterned with tiny white flowers. About now, Sister Margaret was standing before the class saying, "Take your places, children." Closing his eyes for an instant, Pierre could smell the chalk dust and freshly oiled maple floor, and the damp winter clothing drying on a line behind the stove. He could hear Sister reading her favorite Bible verse, "Lay not up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt, and where thieves." When the brigade stopped for breakfast, Lalone checked on Pierre's hands. "So how's the paws holding up today?" he asked, reaching out to inspect a hand. "Whew," he whistled, studying the oozing blisters. "Looks like you've been leaning on a hot griddle." "These are almost as bad as mine were on my first trip out. My hands blistered up and bled so bad that I whined constantly. The fellows threatened to throw me in for fish bait." Lalone laughed. "Now let me show you a little trick." While breakfast was cooking, the bowsman took some deer-hide strips out of his pack. "It's doeskin, the softest stuff you'll ever find," he said. And then he took Pierre's paddle and wrapped the handle with several turns. "There, that should help." "What's this?" Beloy interrupted. "Does our puppy need padding for his little hands?" Pierre looked away, but the ugly man stepped closer and examined the newly wrapped paddle. "If I'd only known," he continued in mock concern, "my mother has some pretty silk gloves she could have loaned." Lalone cut him off, saying, "Stick your ugly puss in somebody else's business." As Beloy walked off crackling, Lalone said, "Consider the source. Don't let him get to you." But Pierre hated Jean Leboy more and more every day. He stared at him. If only he could crack the crude fellow over the head with his paddle. One harsh swing was all he wanted. Pierre smiled to himself as he imagined the cedar blade splintering over the brute's head. He was sure the other crewsmen would cheer, and even if Beloy stabbed him in the heart, Pierre would die content. The paddle handle helped, but the pain was still severe. Shortly after breakfast, it began to rain. Pierre pulled his cap over his ears and hunched down, but the other men pulled off their shirts and stuffed them under the oilcloth tarp that protected the freight. Steam rose off the naked shoulders of the crew. Pierre watched the rain bead up on dark-skinned Emile, who was sitting directly in front of him. As the rain increased, the water coursed down his back. Charbonneau leaned toward Pierre, saying, "If it wasn't too late, I'd tell him I'd tell you to shed your clothing." "What good would that do?" Pierre asked. "You'll see shortly," Emile said, turning. His expression made Pierre nervous, for though Emile had only been in the brigade for 2 years, he knew a lot about voyageur life. A short while later, Pierre understood Emile's grin. Though the other men paddled freely, his soaked shirt made it hard for him to lift his arms. The heavy fabric clung to his shoulders, and his collar channeled a river down his back and into his pants. Soon he began to itch. He twisted on his seat between paddle strokes, and Charbonneau chuckled. "What is the trouble, monsieur?" he asked. "Have you wet your breeches, perhaps?" When the sun came out, the other men put their shirts back on, but Pierre took his off and draped it over the gunwale to dry. The flies swarmed over him. One bit him on the shoulder, and 2 more left big welts in the middle of his back. "You must have sweet blood," Charbonneau remarked. "The flies sing like they found a honeypot." Though it didn't make sense, the pain of his bites made him forget the pain of the paddling. He didn't even know what had happened until their next rest stop. Pierre put his hands on the gunwale and got a jolt of pain. The blisters were raw, but he couldn't remember when he'd last felt them. Could those old-timers be right after all? Pierre wondered as he stepped onto the beach. While the crewmen lit their pipes and rested, Pierre stretched his legs and studied his swollen hands. And that's the end of Chapter 9.